Oh, are you ready? Indigenous cultural burning, recognition, and awareness is on the rise. In Canada, groups like the Indigenous Leadership Initiative and the Thunderbird Collective are leading the way. And in Australia, the Bega Local Aboriginal Land Council. And why is the insurance industry so interested in supporting cultural burning when they don't insure a lot of on-reserve remote homes, businesses, and other structures? In this video, we dive into why it's important for nations to understand the insurance industry, what dictates pricing, how it fits in with restoration, emergency management assistance program through Indigenous Services Canada, and emergency management. And is the insurance industry going to do anything to benefit Indigenous communities that lowers insurance industry risk in other communities that are non-Indigenous? This is Hazardscape Indigenous Emergency Management. And as always, if you enjoy this video and you find it valuable, please like and subscribe so others like you can find it. Insurance is just a way to spread risk. It's just a big pool of money that we all pay into. So if one of us has a house fire or a car collision, that money gets drawn out of that pool to pay for the loss and damage. So in the entire Canadian insurance ecosystem, these are the main players. Primary insurers, those would be the ones that you go to for your car, home insurance. Reinsurers, like Lloyd's of London in the UK or Swiss Re, they provide a backstop to the primary insurers in case the claims are really big. Brokers and agents, they connect customers to insurance products. Regulators like the government, industry associations like the Insurance Bureau of Canada, and research and advisory bodies like the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction and the Wildfire Resilience Consortium of Canada. So where do First Nations, Métis, and Inuit fall within this system? Well, there's not a lot of information that's readily available. The Assembly of First Nations did strike a steering committee to engage with the insurance industry on flood risk. And the First Nations Finance Authority has done a feasibility study on an Indigenous-owned insurance model, but the public information on a lot of these initiatives is quite sparse. So what kind of insurance is there? Well, there's two types or two categories. There's insurance for car collisions, home fires, and commercial insurance. And then there's life insurance, critical illness insurance, medical insurance. We're going to focus on property and casual insurance. How is insurance premiums, your annual cost, determined? And why is it so high for First Nations and other Indigenous communities in remote areas? Well, it comes down to 6 main categories that determine a community's or a homeowner's level of risk. If you have a high exposure to risk like wildfires or flood or landslide, that's going to increase your cost. If you take a really low deductible, meaning maybe you don't want to have to pay out $5,000 at the start of your claim, you only want to pay out $500, that's going to increase your annual premium. What is the market competition like in your region or your area? If there's not a lot of competition, you're going to be paying more. What is your history? Have you had a lot of claims? If so, it's going to cost more. And what is your coverage limit? Let's say, for example, you have $80,000 worth of contents in your home. Do you insure it for $80,000? Or do you insure it for half of that and take a lower annual premium? All of these things contribute to, one, you being able to get insurance in the first place and the cost of it. Then when you make a claim, you're going to go through a process. First, the insurance company needs to know what happened, so you have to report it. Then they're going to verify it, investigate on site, evaluate the cost and loss, and then they're going to make a payment. And Indigenous Services Canada, through their Emergency Management Assistance Program, uses the exact same process. In fact, they require a level 3 insurance adjuster or equivalent to conduct that assessment. And then in terms of cultural burning, how can that help reduce your risk or your community's risk? When you do cultural burning, you reduce the fuel load in the area, which then means either a fire won't start or it reduces the intensity of a fire if one exists, which then in turn, you reduce your risk, which can mean lower insurance premiums. And that's why insurance companies are so interested and supportive of cultural burning practices, because they need to figure out ways to reduce their risk through new ways of managing the land. And they need locally led teams who can do this with minimal resources, because building fire breaks, expensive. Environmentally, it's not good. You need massive amounts of government resources to conduct that work. Having locally led fire guardians, land guardians, any type of guardian to go out and do this work on an annual basis throughout the summer, in the spring, in the winter, it's less expensive. But who's going to pay for your guardians to be trained and be out on the land full time to do all of this? That's a big question that I have. How are insurance companies going to utilize your traditional knowledge, and how will that be used by non-Indigenous communities, and what is your benefit? My main concerns around the whole system in general, not just the insurance system, but organizations that get stood up and supported by insurance, is what is the change that we can expect? Because I don't have the data on this, and I haven't researched it. And frankly, this is really up to organizations like the Insurance Bureau of Canada and the Institute for Catastrophic Loss and the Wildfire Resilience Consortium of Canada to communicate and report. But, if those entities, like I think the Institute of Catastrophic Loss and Resort, ICLR, I think it's been around since the 90s. You can fact check me on that, but what have they contributed it to? Like, if they didn't exist today and had never existed, would we be worse off right now? Because in my experience, since the early 2000s, we've had major losses: Slave Lake burn down, ice storms. We've seen Fort McMurray, Jasper, big First Nations, Little Red River Cree Nation. We've got, power outages at Cross Lake right now. There's so many First Nations evacuations. Like, if we didn't have these groups, would we be worse off? Are we actually in a much more positive spot today, economically, financially, from a loss perspective? I don't know. And I'm not really here to answer that. I'm here to kind of hold some accountability to these publicly funded organizations for, communicating more to us, teaching us more about what are they actually doing, who's actually benefiting from what they're doing. Because if a claim is large enough, so let's say you're a First Nation and you have a $30 million insurance claim, that claim gets reviewed by the reinsurer, like Lloyd's of London in the UK. There will be people meeting there discussing the major loss, and that impacts you. If they're across the Atlantic Ocean, not in the local community, seeing the realities, and nations aren't provided the opportunity to communicate that and what's going on. And if the brokers and agents aren't doing that, it's the nations that suffer. And, if a nation does have a big loss, and I have seen this, if nations have a big loss, those insurance companies, your insurance company may drop you. They may pay out and then say, see you later, go find somebody else. And if your claim within your market, meaning Alberta, Yukon, your jurisdiction, if that market says, you've had a $30 million claim, we aren't going to insure you, you may not get insurance anywhere. That's a huge risk. And this begs the question about Indigenous Services Canada, their emergency management assistance program, especially the response and recovery grant streams. The federal government can't continue to pay out, hundreds and hundreds up to billions of dollars every few years on wildfire, flood, landslide costs. You're going to start to see them, change their policies and their thresholds around, and they're going to try and disperse the risk a little bit more. So one example is maybe they're talking to the insurance industry about picking up more of that risk on reserve. Or maybe nations are going to have to cost share. So maybe one day EMAP for response and recovery will only pay 80% and the nation's got to find 20%. Especially if you're like a larger nation like Enoch Cree Nation that might be more financially viable. Will Indigenous Services Canada be coming to you and saying, hey, look, if something happens and you don't have insurance and it's uninsurable and typically would have been eligible through Emergency Management Assistance Program, you're now going to have to pay 20% of that claim because you didn't take the steps to mitigate that loss. And if you're a treaty First Nation, I'm sure you're already way ahead of me on this, but from a treaty perspective, can they do that through the EMAP, Emergency Management Assistance Program? Can they change the thresholds and eligibility as per treaties in the Indian Act and how emergency management is interpreted? So this also makes me wonder the data, the information that these insurance industry supported organizations are collecting, all of that has to be funneled somewhere for policy decisions. And, how are they viewing that data and that story? How are they using it to create a system that benefits them less than it might benefit Indigenous communities? And where are the Indigenous voices at that table saying, hey, look, if you're going to use this data about our communities and our traditional knowledge to benefit a system that makes it less risky and costly for you, why are you not at the table? Mark Carney said this at his World Economic Forum. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Stacy, my mentor from Siksika, always told me, if you're not at the table, you're not getting fed, you're going to come to the table hungry and you're going to accept anything. And we can't allow that system to kind of flourish up through the insurance industry and the governments. That's why these publicly funded organizations have to be held accountable for how they're doing their work, making their decisions, and including Indigenous peoples. This whole video is just an example of where HazardScape kind of injects itself into the larger emergency management system for Indigenous communities in Canada. And this is an area we're going to continue to follow up on because it's super important. And we want to, support organizations like the Indigenous Leadership Initiative and the Thunderbird Collective that are really focused on locally led integrity through funding, ethical funding, and trying not to be influenced by, big institutions or government entities, at least from what I can take from reading their materials online and seeing, them behave as organizations. If you want to engage more on this topic with us, you can always visit our Patreon where we do live streams, live chat sessions, provide more information on what we find, and host a little bit more of an intimate setting where it's moderated and safe for all Indigenous peoples.